Chapter 13 focuses on controlling for quality and productivity. Controlling establishes mechanisms to ensure that objectives are achieved. Continuous improvement is vital for staying ahead of competitors. The Boston Athletic Association is an organization that puts on running events in and around the greater Boston area. Their primary event is the Boston Marathon. They also put on 10Ks, 5Ks, and half marathons. So it's important for them to establish some mechanisms in which they can ensure that the events that they put on are successful. There are four primary internal control mechanisms that help to achieve organizational objectives. The first are preliminary controls, in which organizations try to anticipate and foresee future problems. So when you're putting on an event, things like contingency plans, like checking the race course, talking to security guards, police, etc., to try to head off and anticipate any major issues. The second are concurrent controls, in which when the race is going on, are there things that, like runners on the course who shouldn't be, do you have your security get them off so it doesn't disrupt it? Rework controls. In this instance, maybe you could think of it as like they made Boston Marathon jackets that had spelling errors, so they've sent it to a foreign land and given away that product for free, so they don't really, because they can't really fix it at that point. And then finally, damage control is when you're trying to ensure that the public, your customers, aren't influenced by the mistakes. So there's a lot of damage control done after the bombing went off and killed a number of different people to make people feel safe in running this marathon and safe in watching the marathon. They spent a lot of time on that, a lot of time with victims to try to minimize that PR disaster and that actual bombing disaster that occurred a few years ago. The first step in the control process is to set objectives, and you can think about setting objectives within these 5 criteria to make things much more clear. The first area is quantity. It's much easier to quantitatively measure performance than it is to qualitatively measure performance. So in this instance with the Boston Athletic Association, maybe you have a person who's in charge of selling a certain amount of sponsorships. Did they meet their sales goal? Did they have the right number, like in total cost as well as total sponsors? The second is quality. So how well must the job be done and how many errors are acceptable? The third is time. Is there a deadline set on the job? So the Boston Marathon is in 2017 every year, April. So what's the time frame and deadlines they need to meet those checkpoints for the sponsorship? The third are cost. So how much should it cost to do the job? And then finally, behavior. What should employees do and not do? And that's usually covered by your standing plans with policies, procedures, and job descriptions that kind of govern employee behavior in the workplace. The second step in the control process is measuring performance. The biggest key here are identifying areas that are called critical success factors. So what are the most important things in which you need at least satisfactory results that will ensure successful achievement of the objective or standard? So the other key thing here is that you need to figure out what to measure and how frequently to measure it. So you have to make sure that you can measure it, that it's going to be cost effective to measure it if you have to measure it multiple times. So in terms of the Boston Marathon, they may measure how many runners they get, they may measure how many sponsors they get, how many volunteers, those sorts of things to figure out whether or not the event was a success. And same for their other events that they put on, like the half marathon pictured here, the 5K, the 10K, etc. The next step in the control process is to take the performances that you just measured and then compare them with the standards you set for yourself going into the project. So that way you can figure out whether or not you're on the way to achieving the goal, or if there are other things that you need to do because you've fallen behind or something to that extent. The final step in the control process is to correct or reinforce. So at this point, you should have corrected certain performances that may not have led to achievement of goals, or reinforced behavior that did lead to achievement of organizational goals. So in an event like the 2015 Boston Athletic Association distance medley, if they had a lot of runners, maybe more than the year before, or hit their max amount of runners that they wanted, if the event went off without any major problems, then the employees who organized and put on that event should be rewarded, so that that behavior and the steps that they took to put on a quality event are reinforced. There are a number of different measures in which to control performance. Constant controls involve continuous use. So the first area of constant controls are self-control, in which you're examining how well your employees can work without somebody looking over their shoulder, so they have enough self-control to get the job done. The second is clan control, so that's about the culture and the norms that are set within the organization that sort of pressure people to stay along. So if you work for the Boston Athletic Association and the culture of that organization is to work 12 to 14-hour days, ideally that you'd hire people that could fit within that program, and the culture itself would help keep them in line. And then finally, standing plans. As I said earlier, those are essentially policies, procedures, job descriptions that provide guidelines for employees in terms of how to work, what they should be doing, how to do it, and so forth. Periodic controls are used on a regular basis in a number of different ways, from once a day, maybe to once a week, once a month to once a year. And scheduled reports, perhaps the Boston Athletic Association after each event has someone that writes up a report, gives an overview of each of the events, like how many runners, how much money they made, how many volunteers it took to put it on, how many sponsors, so that people constantly in that organization know what's going on. Second are budgets, and I'll go into a little bit more of the financial controls part in a couple slides, but essentially budgets are one of the most widely used control tools so that people aren't spending the organization's money haphazardly. And finally, audits can be either internal or external, and it's essentially when people come in and look at the financial statements to ensure that nobody's embezzling any money, nobody's hiding any money, etc. Financial controls primarily encompass three main areas: the master budget, which is essentially the operating budget, capital budget, and financial income sheets, financial statements. The operating budget, as the name implies, focuses on how much money is it going to take to operate the organization and the events, in this instance like Boston Athletic Association and all the events that they put on. The capital budget is really more focused on allocating funds for improvements. So, for example, we're putting together a plan to build a new facility for athletics, exercise science, etc., and those are considered capital expenditures. So building a new facility, improving on a current or existing facility. The income statement is one of the primary financial statements. It presents revenues and expenses and the profit or loss for the stated time period. There are two primary ways to increase net income. One is to increase revenues, and two is to decrease expenses. The combination of the two is the most effective strategy. The balance sheet is another type of financial statement. It has assets, liabilities, and owner equity. Assets are what the organizations own. Liabilities are what it owes to others, so any existing loans, etc. And then owners and stockholders' equity is assets minus the liabilities, or the share of assets that they own free and clear. This statement is called a balance sheet because the total assets always equal the total liabilities plus owner's equity. Another area of control is the human control framework. In this, it's basically when you're working with employees, again, trying to get them to achieve organizational goals. The chapter talked about this idea of a coaching model in which you coach the person through various stages to get them to achieve different types of goals or what have you. So the first is you want to describe their current performance. So what are they doing well, what are they doing poorly? Describe the desired performance. So if they're not doing what you want them to do, you have to give a comparison. And then 3, get them to commit to the change so that they're invested in the process. And then 4, follow up to make sure that they are doing what you would agree that they would do. So when you're doing this, you should give some more positive feedback so that you motivate rather than demotivate employees, and then make sure you take some corrective action. So if you see them not performing to their potential, or you see them doing things wrong, can you step in and ask them, what they see that they're doing, how can they correct the behavior? There are a few different ways to maintain productivity in sport organizations to ensure success. The first is to increase the output and maintain the input value. So basically you want to some extent you could, for example, charge more, like a higher entry fee for one of these races, while maintaining the cost that it takes to put on a race. The second is to maintain the output value and decrease the input value. So maybe you keep the cost of the race the same and figure out how to cut costs while you're putting it on or leading up to the event and organizing it. The third way is to increase the output value and decrease the input value. So you charge more and then you figure out how to, again, like really make the cost to put the event on a lot smaller. So in sum, the final function of management controlling is important because it's first designed to identify problems organizations may face. Mechanisms like internal, external, and financial controls are also designed to create standards and checkpoints so that organizations can continually monitor progress towards their goals.